Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo wars that were a big highlight during the 1990s. Now we all know the Super Nintendo came out in 1991. It was the predecessor to the Nintendo Entertainment System. And of course the Sega Genesis was the predecessor to the Sega Master System. And both of these consoles were really going at it. Here's an example. I didn't bring my systems in here. They're in the living room. I didn't really want to hook them everything. But here's an example. Streets of Rage for the Sega Genesis. You can see there. Get a little better look at it. And then, of course, we have Lethal Enforcers for the Super Nintendo. And both of these systems I've owned for a long time. I believe we had the Sega Genesis first, my brother and I, and then we had the Super Nintendo. And I also have the original Nintendo 64, the other PlayStation, so on and so forth. But the two consoles battle each other through advertisements, and a lot of the games were different. Like, just as an example, they had, which I actually own in my collection, they had a WWF Raw game that the Genesis version, you had Hulk Hogan. The Super Nintendo version, you did not. The graphics were, in my opinion, on some of the games, the Genesis, the graphics were a lot better. It seemed that they were a lot smoother. There wasn't a lot of transition between, scenes in the games on certain ones. But, I mean, Super Nintendo, you had Mario Kart, you had Super Mario World, trying to think of some more exclusive titles. You had, Secret of Mana, the Zelda series, Final Fantasy was a big deal. And the Genesis, you had Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, trying to think of some other ones on that system. Some of my other favorites are Terminator versus RoboCop is a lot of fun. Sunset Riders came out on both systems. For some reason, the Super Nintendo version is worth quite a bit more. It can be a little bit more costly. The Sega version was different. In my opinion, I didn't really like it as much. Probably because I grew up on the Super Nintendo version, and you had 4 characters instead of, I think on the Genesis, if I remember correctly, you only got 3 or 2. I don't remember exactly, but to me, the controls were a lot stiffer on that game on the Genesis. I remember renting it for the first time from my local video store, Old Town Video, and then I ended up buying it. I rented a lot of games, mostly Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis. I rented a bunch of games over the years. When the place actually closed back in 1999, unfortunately, I bought a lot of them, which was really cool because I own a lot of them still to this day. But the one thing I want to talk about with Lethal Enforcers was it was a port from the arcade. And of course you had the gun controllers, which was a cool addition. To me, the Genesis version was a little bit better in my opinion. Streets of Rage, there were 3 of them. And it was pretty much a beat 'em up. I mean, you went through and you had baseball bats, drain pipes. You got attacked by a bunch of gang members. It was pretty cool soundtrack throughout the game. I thought it was pretty cool. But we all know what system came out on top of those wars. Of course, you remember the famous Genesis does what Nintendo don't. But they, had many campaigns going back and forth to each other, which you wouldn't really see that nowadays. Sega now makes software and games for other companies, such as Nintendo, which it's kind of sad that Sega went away. They tried with the 32X edition to the Sega Genesis. The Sega CD did not work. The Then they had the Sega Saturn, and I believe it came out in '95, if I'm correct. And the last attempt was the Sega Dreamcast, which the Sega Dreamcast was way beyond its time. It was unfortunate that it did not last as long as it should have. It just couldn't compete with PlayStation. It just couldn't do it. And Nintendo, after the Super Nintendo, you had the GameCube, the Nintendo Wii, and then of course the new generation of Wii U. Don't get me wrong, Nintendo did go through some rough years. A lot of people, I mean, you either like the GameCube or you don't. I personally own a GameCube. I've played a handful of games on it. Excuse me. I've just never really been a fan of the system. I mean, when GameCube was out, I was playing PlayStation and PlayStation 2, so I didn't play the GameCube. It just wasn't my thing. I picked up a Sega Dreamcast and a Sega Saturn from a garage sale a couple years ago, so I mean, there's a handful of good titles for both of those systems as well that are, you know, pretty decent, but overall, you know, because of just, I wouldn't say bad marketing, it just, Sega, you know, they relied mostly on sports titles. I mean, that's pretty much all that's on the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast, are sports titles. I mean, there are a handful of games that were really good on the system, but not enough to actually keep the popularity of the system going. Super Nintendo, one of my biggest memories, since it is pretty close to tomorrow's Christmas Eve, I remember we used to go to Florida every year for Christmas. And I remember the day before we left to go to the airport, we were playing Super Mario World at the living room. It was myself, my brother, my mom and dad, and we were playing Super Mario World. It was such a fun game. I still have it. I play it a lot. It's just very fun. It can be really difficult, but that's the challenge of it. Same thing with Genesis. I remember playing Streets of Rage with my brother. Or trying to think of some of the other games that I really like. Donkey Kong Country for Super Nintendo. Like I said, Sunset Riders, Power Rangers, Beavis and Butthead. There's just so many good games, and I miss playing both of those systems. I mean, I still play them a lot, don't get me wrong. I actually play those systems more than when I play my PlayStation 3 or my Xbox 360. I mean, I like the new systems, but I will always be tried and true to the older systems that I grew up with. And they were always, every game that I have is just pure nostalgia for me. It's awesome, you know, when I pop in one of these cartridges, you know, in my system and plug in my controller and play, and I instantly transport back to being a kid again. You know, for that short amount of time, I just, you know, play the game and not worry about stuff. It's a lot of fun. I encourage all those, you know, who either grew up with the system, try it again. Go back to it. Borrow some of your friends' games. Go over to your friend's house. Or for those who have not yet to get into, I wouldn't really call it retro. I mean, retro gaming is kind of a bad term in my opinion. It is what it is. Retro gaming is games that were, you know, are older. Me, I wouldn't call it retro gaming for me because I grew up with it. It was the games that I grew up with. Retro gaming to me would be Atari because Atari came out in the 70s. I wasn't alive yet. So, but anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this episode about the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo and the Genesis comparisons. It's one of those things that will always be just kind of, you know, in gaming history. It's always been interesting to me to watch different videos and people's opinions about it and all that kind of stuff. But like this video, subscribe to the channel for more, and I'll see y'all later.